company. Where were the money? How they might go video like this? Nowhere they can.
For about 12 years, one website collected footage that was too extreme for almost anywhere else on the internet. The site was called BestGore. It became one of the most well-known shock sites of its era. Videos that were removed from other platforms within hours often ended up there instead. Behind it was a Slovak Canadian named Marek who lived in Edmonton, Alberta. He launched BestGore on April 30th, 2008. From the start, he built the site around uncensored footage and images of war, crime, accidents, and violence. Mark defended this material on journalistic grounds. He argued that people could not fully understand what human beings were capable of doing to one another if they were only shown cleaned-up versions of events. To make his point, he compared graphic images to the warning photographs on Canadian cigarette packages. The underlying idea was simple: showing people the reality of something could be more powerful than merely telling them about it. That was the philosophy behind the site. Yet in practice, there was almost no moderation. And as time went on, the gap between Mark's public interest claims and what the site actually hosted would eventually be tested in court. One of the first posts on BestGore was footage from 2004 showing the beheading of Eugene Armstrong. Now, Armstrong was an American civil engineer working reconstruction projects in Iraq, and on September 16, 2004, gunmen kidnapped him from his home in Baghdad's Mansour district along with two colleagues, fellow American contractor Jack Hensley and British civil engineer Kenneth Bigley. Well, the kidnappers were from Tawhid and Jihad, a militant group led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They demanded the release of Iraqi women they said were being held in U.S. military detention facilities. American officials said no women matching that description were held there. When the deadline passed, the group released a video showing Armstrong in an orange jumpsuit. The militants read a statement before killing him on camera. Both colleagues were later killed as well. The video had already circulated online in 2004. When BestGore launched 4 years later, this footage set the tone for what the site would become. Within months of launching, the archive was already growing. BestGore was slowly competing with other shock sites for the most extreme material. The videos that ended up there were often rare clips that had been scrubbed from mainstream platforms. That era was the starting point when shock videos became so famous that friends used to send them to each other to scare one another. In December 2008, a video appeared online showing a Ukrainian man seriously injuring himself with a glass jar in a private setting. The footage spread rapidly and sparked reaction videos and debates over whether it was real or staged. Within a week, a forum thread discussing the clip had received more than 125 replies. But the story changed when Mark managed to interview the man himself. The man identified himself as Alex, a 40-year-old sales manager from Ukraine and a father of two. According to Alex, he had been engaging in similar dangerous behavior for around 12 years, beginning with a Coca-Cola bottle. He described the injuries he suffered afterward, including several days of bleeding and weeks of severe pain. He said he avoided going to a hospital because he feared doctors would ask questions about what had happened. Alex said he uploaded the video partly to warn people about how dangerous the activity was, but also because he found the situation bizarre and funny. What had started as one of the internet's most infamous shock videos had become something different, a real person explaining what happened behind the footage. That was one of the things that made BestGore different from other shock sites. Mark was not always satisfied with simply reposting material. Sometimes he tried to find the people behind it and document the story surrounding the footage. BestGore also developed a small but active community of regular users who created their own inside jokes and traditions around the material. One of the most well-known was the idea of pointers. Users would sometimes notice people in the background of photographs appearing to point toward a victim, and they began calling these people pointers. Another running joke involved flip-flops. In photographs from Brazil, users noticed that people who had died were often still wearing them. It happened so frequently that members would sometimes try to spot the flip-flops before anything else and point them out in the comments. For some users, this kind of humor became a way of dealing with the disturbing material they were constantly exposed to. But the site had almost no moderation, and the comment sections regularly contained racism, slurs, and toxic attacks directed at victims. The lack of rules meant the darkest comments stayed visible alongside serious discussions about terrorism, politics, and world events. Mark rarely intervened, and over time the comment culture became as extreme as the footage itself. The site also became a permanent host for older footage that had circulated before BestGore existed. In 2007, a Russian neo-Nazi group called Format 18, led by Maxim Marcinkiewicz, carried out a double killing that would become one of the most notorious videos associated with BestGore. On April 20, 2007, the group lured two men to an isolated location outside Moscow by telling them they were going to take part in a staged video for a news report. One of the victims was a 24-year-old from Dagestan named Shamil. He had moved to Moscow the year before looking for work, and had reportedly told his family that he had experienced repeated harassment from extremist groups. The second victim was never officially identified. Marcinkiewicz had a reason for wanting real violence on camera. Before this, Format 18 had released a fake execution video. People online quickly accused the group of staging it. Marcinkiewicz wanted to prove that Format 18 was capable of carrying out something real. This time, the footage documented a real crime. The group recorded the two victims and forced them to make statements on camera before both were killed. The recording was later released online as propaganda, with music, swastika imagery, and nationalist slogans surrounding the violence. The video spread rapidly across the Russian internet, but investigators initially questioned whether it was authentic. Then, in 2008, Shamil's family recognized his clothing in the footage. His brother, Artur, was brought to Moscow and testified about the identification. That breakthrough helped investigators establish what had happened. But the case would remain open for years before accomplices were eventually sentenced. The video drew the attention of German authorities. A German government official contacted Mark and demanded that he remove it from the site. Mark refused. BestGore then faced attacks that overwhelmed its servers and repeatedly knocked the site offline. Governments in several countries also blocked access to the website, making it increasingly difficult for users to reach it. By this point, keeping BestGore online had become a fight on several fronts: government pressure, censorship, and attacks aimed at taking the site offline. The pressure continued for years. Then, in May 2012, a single video pushed the site beyond anything it had faced before. BestGore uploaded footage depicting the murder of Jun Lin, a Chinese student in Montreal. The video was known as One Lunatic, One Ice Pick, and BestGore was one of the first sites to host it. It is believed that the killer himself emailed the video directly to Mark. Users analyzed the footage and identified the killer before police officially named him. The site went from 200 new members per night to 3,000. Over 500,000 visitors arrived in a single day, crashing the servers repeatedly. BestGore had moved from the fringes of the internet to the center of an international manhunt, and millions of people who had never visited the site now knew its name. The case showed the community could piece together evidence quickly, but it also showed the site had no infrastructure to handle mass attention. The video brought legal consequences. Mark was arrested and later pleaded guilty, admitting in court that the Magnotta video was obscene and went beyond any public good defense. He received a conditional sentence that included house arrest and community service. The guilty plea closed the gap between Mark's philosophy of uncensored journalism and what the court ruled was illegal distribution. But the site stayed online and the uploads continued. 2 years later, global conflict would again test what BestGore was willing to host. By 2014, ISIS was rapidly expanding across Iraq and Syria, and videos from the conflict were spreading across social media, news sites, forums, and websites like BestGore. On August 19, 2014, ISIS released a video showing the beating of American journalist James Foley. The video showed Foley wearing an orange jumpsuit beside a masked militant speaking with a British accent. The militant was later identified as Mohammed Mwazi, who became known as Jihadi John. Foley was forced to deliver a statement condemning American policy. The video then showed his killing and introduced another American journalist, Steven Sotloff, threatening that he would be next if American airstrikes continued. Major platforms moved quickly to remove copies and prevent the footage from spreading. For Mark, the Foley video fit the principle that had defined BestGore from the beginning. But this case exposed a problem that was becoming harder to ignore. There was a difference between documenting something disturbing and giving a terrorist organization another channel through which to distribute its message. That distinction made BestGore's role increasingly complicated. The site was not just dealing with shocking footage anymore. It was sitting at the intersection of documentation, censorship, propaganda, and public access. President Obama condemned the killing, and Foley's family continued speaking publicly about his life and work. By 2016, the focus of BestGore's new uploads had shifted. Middle Eastern war footage was no longer dominating the site. More and more videos were coming from Mexico, particularly footage connected to cartel violence. The growing use of mobile phones made it easier for this kind of violence to be recorded and circulated online. But cartel footage served a different purpose from ISIS propaganda. These videos were generally not created to send a political message to foreign governments. They were meant to intimidate rivals, demonstrate power, and spread fear among local communities. At the same time, BestGore continued collecting footage from around the world. India became another major source. It is one of the most populated countries on Earth, and videos from there were regular uploads. Every day, something worse seemed to happen. Train accidents became so common on the site that if a thumbnail showed a train, users would guess it was definitely India. These videos frequently resurfaced on Indian social media with completely false narratives attached to them. Fact-checkers would trace the footage back to its original source. Sometimes, BestGore helped identify old clips falsely shared as recent incidents in India. While BestGore was collecting material from around the world, one video from Mexico would become infamous for a reason no one expected. Around 2016, a video began circulating across shock sites including BestGore and quickly became infamous for its disturbing footage and the bizarre music playing in the background. The recording involved cartel members and a captive while several songs played in the background. Then, near the end, something completely unexpected happened. Lip Sync's disco hit Funkytown began playing. The upbeat song created an unsettling contrast with what was happening on screen. Before long, the video became known simply as Funkytown. It spread far beyond the shock site community and eventually became part of internet lore. The victim was believed to have been connected to a rival cartel or accused of betraying his own group, based partly on the Spanish dialogue heard in the recording. There were also claims that a much longer version existed, but no extended version was ever reliably verified. The identity of the cartel involved and the exact location where the recording was made remain unknown. What is known is that Funkytown became one of the most infamous cartel videos on the internet, and BestGore was one of the places where people gathered to discuss it, search for clues, and try to figure out where it came from. After 12 years online, multiple legal battles, 2 arrests, and traffic spikes that had pushed its servers to the limit, Marek announced on November 15, 2020, that BestGore was shutting down. He said he wanted to focus on other interests. 2 days later, when users asked if the site would ever return, Marek replied that the shutdown was most likely permanent. The website, forums, and publicly accessible archive were suddenly gone. There was no major farewell and no clear plan for what would happen to the enormous collection of content. Marek did not sell the domain or hand the site over to another operator. After more than a decade online, BestGore simply stopped being accessible to the public. The exact circumstances were never fully explained, but Marek had spent years dealing with legal battles, financial problems, and the constant demands of running the site. He had previously spoken about how difficult it was to keep it financially sustainable, and by 2020, he said he wanted to step away and live a more peaceful life away from technology. The site had shown how the internet could preserve evidence that might otherwise disappear, but it had also shown how easily real suffering could become entertainment. Marek always argued that people deserve to see reality without the filters used by mainstream media, but BestGore made it impossible to ignore the consequences of that philosophy. BestGore eventually disappeared from the internet, but copies of its footage, the cases behind it, and the debates it created are still scattered across the web. That may be the lasting story of BestGore, not simply what it showed people, but what happened when there were almost no limits on what the internet was willing to show.